We are on Daf Yud Aleph. We're on page 11b, and we've been discussing this concept of ketzitzason zuhi yasiyosan. When you cut it, that could be considered making it. So the question of cutting off the schach from the being attached to the ground, detaching it, could that be considered like you are doing tasa, you're making the schach and making the sukkah, and then it would be a kosher sukkah, even though you put it on in a wrong way at first, but nevertheless you've now made the sukkah in a kosher way because you cut it. Or is that not, or do we not say such a thing? That's really what the Gemara is talking about. That's the Hebrew term for what our Gemara is really dealing with, Rav and Shmuel. And we did see this interesting Tosfos over here that says that even though normally the halacha follows Rav in such scenarios, but here we're going to follow Shmuel. And he says all the Amiroim and all the Shitza. Shitza means the whole like flow of the Gemara, the whole leaning of the Gemara is that it's the shita of the Gemara, the opinion of the Gemara, the general opinion seems to follow Shmuel. So we're going to paskin like Shmuel, and even though normally and when it's not monetary, we paskin like Rav. The Gemara brought different proofs, and we were going over the different proofs that the Gemara had. And then the Gemara got into this idea that maybe this is really a debate. This debate of ketzitzason zuhi asiyasan, maybe we find with regard to hadassim when they have berries. And the case over there was where you have a berry that you have to, you have a berries on the hadassim. And according to halacha, if it has more berries than leaves, it's invalid. And so you need to pluck off those berries that are on the hadassim in order to be kosher. But the question is, what happens if you already made the lulav, attached it all together, you tied it together, and then once you tied it together, you plucked off the berries of the hadassim. So then you have a very similar case where you're sort of like doing it in the wrong order. You're making it in an invalid way. And then after you made it invalid, you're trying to like make a little fix over here. But you really did it wrong. You made it wrong. You did not make it properly. You made it wrong. And now you want to fix one little thing and say, oh, it's perfect now. But no, you didn't make it right. So the same argument will be, can we call plucking it off? Is this called making it? So then you did make it right. Or is it not called making it? It's called fixing something, but ultimately it was made already before, and therefore it won't be correct because it's called tasev leimin ha'asud. Now, the problem really with learning this way is that it doesn't say the word tasa when it talks about making your lulav attached to the hadassim and arav. It doesn't say the word tasa. But the Gemara is saying maybe we learn from sukkah, that in sukkah it says tasa, and lulav maybe is learned from sukkah. That's really where we've been discussing this. And so we have this argument. Reb Shimon bar Yehoitzadok in the Chachamim argue about this case where it's Yom Tov, and you are now plucking the hadassim, the berries off the hadassim. You're plucking the berries off the hadassim. And there's an argument if it's kosher. According to Reb Shimon bar Yehoitzadok, you did it, you plucked it off, it's not kosher, it's invalid. And the rabbis hold it's valid. So the first thought of the Gemara was that that's the argument. Reb Shimon bar Yehoitzadok says you got to do it all right from the beginning. You got to do it right. You got to start it right. That would be like Shmuel. And the rabbis who say it's kosher would be like Rav. That's the flow. Is everyone following with me? This is we got the Gemara clear. Okay. Now, in order to understand this Gemara, you do need to understand these, like have these like the Gemara has some assumptions that you have to you have to follow. The number one assumption is that lulav needs to be tied together with the hadassim and aravis. That's the number one assumption that you've got to accept. The other thing you got to accept is that there is a law of tasev leimin ha'asi by lulav. And then you can debate if this is called fulfilling that or not fulfilling that. Are you falling in? Now, the Tosfos has an interesting question over here. He says, why are we talking about a case of a person who already made his lulav, Erev Yom Tov, made his lulav, and on Yom Tov, he transgressed Yom Tov by picking the berries. Let's pick a case where he made it on Erev Yom Tov, and he didn't do any sin. He plucked the berries off Erev Yom Tov. And you have the same story. You made it in a non-kosher way. It had berries on it. And now you're plucking the berries after you made it already. Is that considered making it now and it's a kosher in a kosher way? Or is it considered doing it in the wrong order and you're now picking berries, fixing a wrongly made lulav? But it was done Erev Yom. Take a case of Erev Yom Tov. Why do we have to talk about a guy who sinned? And this is this is good for some brain stimulation. You have to think about this for a second. It has health benefits if you think into this a little. What would happen if we were talking about Erev Yom Tov? So it was Erev Yom Tov. You would then pluck the berries off. Seemingly be the same thing, right? Pluck the berries off, you still have the same problem.
Except if you untie and retie it at that point, you can still do it before Yom Tov.
So Isaac is coming up with this insight, very important insight, and that is let's remember what we learned in Shulchan Aruch about the problem that it says there that if you do it on Yom Tov, make sure not to tie it in a knot. Right? When you're tying it together on Yom Tov, you got to be very careful because you have to be careful not to tie a knot on Yom Tov. You can't. Now, so what is this? What comes out from that? That if you would do it on Erev Yom Tov, there's an easy way out of this whole problem. If you have this lulav that was made wrong because it had berries on the hadassim, and you tied it together with the berries on it, you tied it together, and then afterwards you want to fix the hadassim part by plucking the berries. So in that scenario, there's no problem because all you got to do is snip your knot that you knotted it together. You tied a lulav brand, you tied a lulav leaf around it, right? So what do? Snip the lulav leaf and put on a new one, Erev Yom Tov. But on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, you can't do that. Why can't you do that? Because you're not allowed to tie a knot. So it becomes much more complicated on Yom Tov than during. So in other words, the reason it picked the case of doing it on Yom Tov is because here you have a case where you're pretty much stuck. But you know what comes out from that? According to this explanation, what comes out from this is that guess what? You're really supposed to knot that attachment, that bundle that you're tying together, the lulav, the hadassim, and aravos, that bunch that you're bunching together and tying, you're really supposed to make a real knot. Because if you really didn't need to make a knot, then it wouldn't make a difference on Yom Tov or before Yom Tov. The fact that we're making such that they have to pick a case of doing it on Yom Tov in order to show this argument between Reb Shimon ben Bar Yehoitzadok and the rabbis is because if you did it Erev Yom Tov, then you could easily just start all over again. What do I mean start all over again? I mean snip it, pluck off the berries, or pluck off the berries and then snip it either way. And then now you have kosher hadassim, you have kosher lulav, you have kosher aravos. tie it now together properly. You pluck the berries already. You can start all over and start fresh. And now you can really do a tasa that you're making it in a kosher way, v'loy min ha'asui, not by fixing something afterwards where you did it in a wrong way. So the fact that it's learning this way shows that you're really supposed to make a knot. So now what we understand is, and although although we're aware of our minhag is not really to make a knot, we use some type of a little belt that the kids all know how to make. They fold it in a certain way and they make this belt around it. But in Shulchan Aruch, it says to make a knot. Do you know why? Because our Gemara seems to hint that. Our Mishnah, the Mishnah that we're quoting, that we're quoting here, seems to hint that you're supposed to make a knot around it. It's supposed to be a real knot. And that's why it picked the case of on Yontiv where you did it, and now you're stuck because you're not going to be able to make that knot. If you want to start all over, you can start all over, but you won't be able to make that knot. So in other words, it's pretty much showing us about how that the way, at least in the Gemara, it's implied that there's a necessity to make a knot, and that's why it picked this case where it's already yontiv, and you're not gonna be able to make that knot if you want to start all over. There is two other answers Tosfos gives. One of them is along the same lines as we just said, but picking at a different aspect of it, a little different point, and that is that when it gives a case that it's Yom Tov already, and now you're plucking the berries, so the case must be that you already tied it together, and you're plucking the berries. Why? Because it's on Yom Tov already, and on Yom Tov you can't tie a knot. So it must be that you already tied the whole lulav together, and now you're plucking the. In other words, when you pick a case that it's Yom Tov already, we don't have to explain that you already tied it together because you had to have tied it together on Erev Yom Tov. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to tie it now together. It must be that you already tied it together. If we pick the case of Erev Yom Tov, then it could be that you didn't tie it yet together, and then maybe there's a different machlokes there. But the fact that it picks the case of An Yom Tov, it must be that you already tied them together, and that's why, and therefore, on Yom Tov, there's going to be an argument. In other words, the whole argument is after you've already tied it together. That's where you have this argument of Reb Shimon bar Yotzadok and the Chachamim.
The question on the fact that the hadassim, they're no longer attached to the ground. Is this right? Plucking the berries? Is this the oraita or because you're fixing? Is in other words, it's not attached to the ground anymore.
Right.
So now when you're plucking these berries off of there, what isur are we doing? Not being allowed to fix, or not being allowed to
plucking the berries? Plucking the berries is a problem of tikkun kli. Now, is it a daraisa? It's a good question. It's not so simple to say that. Probably it's rabbinic. You got a good point there. It's probably a rabbinic issue that you can't pick them. You're not supposed to pick them. But the other question is, what's the prohibition of having berries there and not plucking them off? Okay, you can't use such a lulav that has hadassim that have you can't. In other words, what is the problem of having hadassim with berries? So if you learn that that's a daraisa, if that's a biblical command that you can't have the berries there, then it fits with our Gemara that, in other words, you need to pluck them off. You weren't supposed to. You did rabbanon, whatever. You sinned by plucking them off, but it still falls into the category problem. The problem that we're dealing with is ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui, which is also a biblical command of making it in the right way. But let's say the berries on a hadas is more of a rabbinic problem than a biblical problem. It would be a little interesting to try to say, oh, Well, now you have a problem of tasav leimin ha'asi. If you made it right according to the biblical rules, because there's nothing wrong with having berries on it, and you fixed it, you only fixed the rabbinic. Are we going to say that there's another problem of that you did it in the wrong way because there's a biblical problem of tasav leimin ha'asi, even though this is only a rabbinic law of doing it? You get what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if you would take it that far. So basically the bottom, but your question of the berries being, in other words, if we take your question and we look into the problem of having berries on it, which seemingly is it's in Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis. Seemingly that's where we would have to look and just see. Let me just see over there if that's a biblical problem or a rabbinic problem. I would like to say it's a biblical problem, but so he says the problem is hadar, and so when the berries are black or red, it's called menumar. It's a problem of hadar. It's not beautiful. Now in Yerushalmi, it says a reason of, it says anaf eitz avos. It's supposed to be an anaf, a branch, and not a tree, not a fruit, because it's a fruit. That's the problem. And only when it's red or black is it considered a fruit.
I certainly have seen.
So it sounds like it's biblical. Or it's a psul hadar only on the first day or on the other days. Yeah, it sounds like it's biblical. Now, the question about plucking plucking them, so Rashi says that it's a iser drabanan, but there is a Mardechai that says that if you're fixing it l'tzorech mitzvah, it's aser min haTorah. That's interesting. Anyway, the simple understanding is it's rabbinic. But the other question is, in other words, plucking it is rabbinic. That's the way Rashi says, pretty clear. Having them on the hadas seems to be biblical. That would make sense. And then we have a problem in our Gemara of Tasav Leimin Ha'asi. Okay, bottom line is we just explained two explanations of Taisvis about the case of these hadassim that have berries, why it's specifically talking about on Shabbos, on Yontiv, that you pluck them on Yontiv and not before. One of them is because if it's on Yontiv, then for sure you already made your lulav. And so when it says you pluck them, we obviously understand that it's talking about a case where you did it already after the fact that your lulav was already made up. And so that's the reason why it says such a case. If it was talking about before Yom Tov, we wouldn't know clearly that the case is that you already made your lulav, put it together, and it could be that you didn't put it together yet, and therefore picks a case of an Yom Tov, so we know clearly you would put it together, and yet you have berries on it, and you pluck them, and you pluck them afterwards. So that's why it's a problem, or it's a problem according to Reb Shimon ben Yehoshua. And then the other answer was that if it was done on Friday, where you made it and you plucked, you took off the berries, So in that case, it wouldn't be such a big deal because you could just redo your lulav because you can retie a knot around it. But on Yontiv, it's not a problem. But on Yontiv, you can't redo it. So therefore, we need to know if it's kosher the way it is or not kosher the way it is. As before Yontiv is no big deal. You could just redo it. So even if it's not kosher, it would be easy to fix. And then Taisus has another answer, and he uses this answer first. Taisus's answer is that there is a concept once something is pushed aside. So regarding certain halachos, we say, push this, you're already pushed off, we're not using you. Like certain laws regarding korbanos, that something has some type of a issue with it that we can't use that korban. And then it gets fixed. But because we have a dichoy, we pushed it aside, we consider it pushed aside forever, so to speak, that we don't use it. So there's a famous question, if that applies to mitzvahs. If something is pushed aside, does it get pushed aside forever or not? So the hadas that we're dealing with has berries. That hadas is not kosher for a hadas. When does that law apply? It applies on Yontiv, that it's when you would use it for a hadas mitzvah would be on Yontiv. And so you might think that there's a dichoy. Once it's pushed aside, you might think you can never use it anymore. And so if it's set a case, if this case would be talking about a case of Erev Yom Tov, then we wouldn't know the halacha that there's no dichoy by mitzvahs. We wouldn't know this halacha that once something is pushed aside for a mitzvah, that we hold that it's not a problem and it's not pushed aside for mitzvahs. Why? We wouldn't know that because on Erev Yom Tov, it's not really a hadas mitzvah yet. It's just a simple myrtle branch. And when the mitzvah comes on Yom Tov, that's when it becomes a mitzvah hadas. And then we would say, oh, it's pushed aside. But before it's even eligible to be a hadas, because it's Erev Yom Tov, there's no such thing as a shaking lulav on Erev Yom Tov. So on that day, there's no discussion about dichoy. There's no way to learn anything about dichoy. So it picked the case of An Yom Tov because that helps us, that teaches us a law about dichoy. Do we say dichoy by mitzvahs or do we not say dichoy by mitzvahs? So the fact that it picks us specifically picked the case on Yom Tov to teach you that the dichoy part is not an issue. The fact that it was once not eligible for a mitzvah, that's not a problem. The problem is something else. But the fact that it was pushed aside, that's no problem. You would be able to fix it. You would be able to pluck off those berries, and it would be okay. But on Yontiv, that's when you see the dichoy, and still we see that it's not a problem. That if you were avar v'likton, the rabbis say it's not a problem, even though it was not eligible for a mitzvah. It's on Yontiv already. And you can't use it because there's too many berries. But if you over and you pluck those berries off, you could use it on Yontiv, and it's not a problem of dichoy. So they teach you an extra law by picking the case of Yom Tov. Okay, so anyway, that's Taisus over here of Hacha b'melech. The other Taisus talks about Reb Shimon ben Bar Yochai. Who was he? And Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was a Tana, Taisus says, and possibly it's the same person who is quoted by Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Yochanan was an Amoira, a very early Amoira. And Amoira came right after the Tanoim, like somewhere around the year 200 and 300, after the Common Era. And the Tanoim were before that. So Rabbi Yochanan quotes Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Taisus says it's not such a problem. And knows that this could work. because Rabbi Yochanan learned from the Tanoim. He was an Amira. He came afterwards, but he learned from Rabbi Shia, from Rebbe. So it's very possible that he learned under Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, and therefore he quotes Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok. So Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok is a Tana, but Rabbi Yochanan, who's an Amira, could have possibly learned from him. But then Taisa says, but there definitely is another Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, because we find some story where Rabbi Yochanan was not overly respectful, where Rish Lakish said something negative and about Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, and Rabbi Yochanan didn't really stick up for him, and so the Taisa says that must be a different Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, who was more of a contemporary, and and therefore there must be two Reb Shimon ben Yitzchoks. So in other words, the point is that Rabbi Yochanan sometimes quotes Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok. It sounds like he learned by him, and also our Avar Velikton Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok. This is definitely a Mishnah, so he's definitely a Tana. There's definitely a Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok that's a Tana, but Tais says there must be another Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok that's an Amira. It's not surprising to have some people with the same name, especially a popular name like Shimon. I don't know Yitzchok, but it must be maybe someone. There must have been some special person named Yitzchok that everyone was people were named after Yitzchok, so therefore wasn't surprising to have two Reb Shimon ben Yitzchoks and a few generations apart. Or maybe they were named after. Maybe the later one was named after the earlier one. Okay, so anyway, that's the other Taisvis. So the Gemara that we're in the midst of reviewing, because we on Friday we still went further. So let's just finish up our review from Friday's Gemara. So the Gemara says here, how do we explain this argument between Reb Shimon ben Bar Yitzchok and the rabbis, the Chacham? How do you explain that argument? They spoke about a case where you took off the berries of the hadas after you already made the lulav, and according to Reb Shimon ben Yitzchok, you cannot use that lulav with those hadassim. It's invalid. And the rabbis hold it's kosher, it's valid. You could shake that lulav. Now, what's the source of their argument? So the first understanding was that maybe it's because of Tasav Leiman Hasi, right? Our story in our Gemara, that maybe it's a problem of, the question is, if by plucking those berries, have you made the lulav then, or do we say that is a problem of Tasav Leiman Ha'asui? That was the first understanding. And it would be the same argument of Rav and Shmuel as Reb Shimon Bar Yitzchok and the rabbis. But the Gemara says no. Then the Gemara says no, that's not the understanding. Everyone agrees that we don't say Ketzitzasan Zuhi Yasiyasa. Everyone agrees like Shmuel. We don't say like Rav said, Ketzitzasan Zuhi Yasiyasa. We don't follow Rav. That cutting it is called making it. No. We follow Shmuel. But here the question is, do you learn lulav from Sukkah? That there's a problem of Tasav Leiman Ha'asi. Do we have, because it doesn't say Tasav Leiman Ha'asi that you have to make it in a kosher way instead of fixing it up later. It doesn't say that by lulav. It says that by Sukkah. It doesn't say that by lulav. So the question is, do we learn this from Sukkah? So the one that says that it's puzzle says you learn from Sukkah that it has to be made in the right way and you can't fix it up afterwards. And therefore, just like a sukkah, you got to lift up each piece of schach. If you put on the schach that's attached to the ground, you got to lift up each piece after you cut it. So here also, the lulav, you would need to The lulav you would need to redo after you plucked off the berries from the hadas. The other opinion would say that we don't learn this problem of tasa v'loimina osui, that you need to make it in a kosher way instead of fixing it later. We don't hold that by lulav, and you're allowed to fix it later. So by a lulav you could fix it later. By a sukkah you can't. Everyone agrees with Shmuel. This is the Gemara's saying, like everyone agrees with Shmuel about the sukkah. You gotta lift up each piece of schach. But regarding the hadassim that have berries, that could be a machla. Could be you don't need to worry about that because it doesn't have to be. It's not a problem. Tasav lemanasi. We don't care about tasav lemanasi when it comes to lulav. It doesn't say the word tasav. You want to learn from sukkah? It doesn't. Who says you learn from sukkah? Then the Gemara says, and if you want, you could say that the argument is really if it needs to be tied together, if a lulav is supposed to be tied. One of the opinions holds it needs to be tied. The other opinion holds it doesn't need to be tied. Now, if it doesn't need to be tied together, so what problem would there be if you plucked the berries off the hadassim before you tied it after? It doesn't have to be tied in the first place. So there's no law of tasev leimena asi because it doesn't have to be tied. There's no tasev. There's nothing to do. You tied it. You didn't tie it. It doesn't matter. There's no obligation to tie it. So can't be a law that you have to tie it in a certain way because you don't need to tie it in the first place according to that opinion. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai Tzadok holds you need to tie it, and since you need to tie it, it has a problem. So in other words, everyone agrees that if you would need to tie it, then we would follow Shmuel. You would need to tie it, and it needs to be done in the right way. You'd learn from Sukkah. But the thing is, who says that you need to tie it? Maybe you don't need to tie it. And now that's where we're up to in the Gemara. We're at 2 lines before the wide lines. Page 11b, 2 lines before the wide line. Uve pelukta dahani tanoi. So it must be about maybe 20 lines up from the bottom of the page. Uve pelukta dahani tanoi. And this would be the argument of those Tanoim, those Tanoic sages. The Tanya that they taught in a brisa. Lulav, a lulav, bein agud, bein shein agud. Whether it's bunched together and tied, or whether it's not tied with the hadassim in a row, it's kosher. It's kosher. You could just take a lulav, take 2 hadassim, 3 hadassim, excuse me, take 2 aravais, hold it together, and hold your lulav and you hold your esrog in the other hand, put them together and goodbye. It doesn't have to be tied. Whether it's tied or not, it's kosher. That's the first opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, agud kosher, shein agud pasul. If it's tied, it is kosher. If it's not tied, it's actually pasul, invalid. My time to Rabbi Yehuda, what's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Because he has a gzeira shava. Because it says regarding the painting putting the blood, putting some blood from the carbon pesach on the doorposts, on the lintel. Touch it to the mashke, the lintel, and to the 2 doorposts. And so you need to take a bunch of hyssop, and that bunch of hyssop, the Gemara understands the aguda. It's a bunch, it's a bundle, and ksiv hasam l'kachtem agudas hyssop. It says over there a bundle of hyssop. Ksiv hachan, it says here l'kachtem lachem. You should take by Yom Rishon on the first day. Ma'ala halon ba'aguda, just like over there, it means an aguda, a bundle with like tied together. So Afkan Nami Ba'aguda here also, it's a bundle, it's tied together. That means the lulav has to be tied together. Why? Because it says lakachtem. It says the same word here, the same word there. And the rabbis had a tradition that this is a gzeira shava. And the Rabbi Yehuda, I should say, had a tradition that this is a legitimate gzeira shava. And therefore, you need to tie it. You need to tie the lulav with the hadassim and arabas. Rabbanan. What about the rabbis? They hold you don't need to. Lakicha lo yalfinan. Lakicha milakicha lo yalfinan. We don't have a tradition. We don't learn a gzeira shava lakicha from lakicha. In other words, it says lakicha here. It says lakicha over there by the doorpost when they were leaving Egypt. You see after they brought the sacrifice, so they put the blood they used a hyssop to dip into the blood, and then they put a little of the blood on their doorpost and on their lintel. So it says we don't learn that the word lakachtem, lakicha here and lakicha there are connected, and therefore just because over there you had to tie the hyssop in a bundle. Here you don't have to tie the lulav in a bundle because we don't have a tradition to learn that the word lakicha from lakicha. So that's basically the final explanation of this argument of Reb Shimon bar Yochai and the rabbis as to plucking the berries off the hadassim. Why would it be kosher and why wouldn't it be kosher? If you pluck the berries off of our velikton, you pluck the berries off the hadassim, would the lulav still be invalid? Okay, so we had three interpretations of why it would be invalid or not, and this conclusion over here is basically saying that there's the word lakicha by both the Korban Pesach when they left Egypt, that specific Pesach that they left Egypt, and the lakicha by the lulav, and according to the rabbis, there is no gzeira shava. We don't have a tradition, this gzeira shava, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is such a tradition that the word lakicha is learned as that we learn a gzeira shava from that word. Tosfos here is interesting. He says the Gemara in Kedushin talks about getting married, that you need to give in order to get married. There's three ways of doing the Kedushin, the first part of marriage. Kesef, shtar, and bia. Kesef means money or something that's valuable, like a ring, a gold ring. Shtar is a document. And bia means to have relations. These three avenues are methods to create the state of kedushin, the first stage of marriage. And the Gemara says, how do you know you can get married with money? So the answer is because you learn Gzeira Shava kicha from Sidei Ephraim, that Avraham bought the field of Ephraim called the Maras Hamachpela in Chevron. He paid money for it, and he used the word kicha there. And it says when you marry a wife, it uses the word kicha, the same word kiyikach isha, right? When you marry a wife, when a man takes a woman, which means he marries a wife. So the Gemara understands that just like there when he bought Maras Hamachpela, the double cave, in Chevron, when he bought that, he paid money, bought it with money, right? He paid 400 shekels of silver. So the same thing applies to marrying a wife. You fulfill the obligation of doing it according to law. Getting married is the first part. Well, kedushin, you can accomplish that with money. So Tosfos is bothered. So our Gemara says that we don't learn Gzeira Shava lakicha, but over there we do have kicha from Sidei Ephraim. So he doesn't explain himself. It sounds like he's saying is that just because we learn that Gzeira Shava doesn't obligate us to learn this Gzeira Shava. That's what it sounds like he's saying. Like, there we actually learn Gzeira Shava. It sounds very similar. The word kicha is to take, and lakachtem lachem also means to take. It sounds like it's the same word, and yet over there you have Gzeira Shava. Here The rabbis don't hold the Gzeira Shava because you don't need to do according to the rabbis, you don't need to take a bundle. Now, the only thing is, what could be, if you dig a little deeper, it could be what Taisus is saying is that the word that in Hebrew is very similar, but there's actually verbs that have 2 letters and 3 letters, and they're not exactly the same. There's the word kach, and there's the word lakach. And there's 2 separate, there's a whole debate between the French grammatarians, or however you call them, and the, the grammar experts and the other grammar experts. And if you could have a 2-letter verb or a root word. Is a root word, could it be 2 letters or does it have to be 3? Anyway, it seems from Taisus that, lekicha and kicha are 2 separate things, 2 separate words. And therefore, if there's a Gzeira Shava for kicha in Kedushin, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have that. It's not surprising that the word lakach, lekicha, doesn't have a Gzeira Shava. Something along those lines. Anyway, Taisus is it doesn't explain himself, but that's what he's touching upon. That there you have a Gzeira Shava, and here not everyone agrees with the Gzeira Shava. Yes, David.
He has a note here that says from the Sfas Emes, says proof that this is not a full-fledged Gzeira Shava. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, only 3 of the 4 species have to be bound, with the esrog remaining outside of the binding.
Huh. Wow, that's an interesting. That's a very interesting point. So that proves that it's not a real Gzeira Shava. That's a very interesting thing. So, so what is it? You would think there's either Gzeira Shava or no Gzeira Shava. How do you have not a real Gzeira Shava? That's definitely an interesting one. Yes, Jeffrey.
There's a special reason that they're not telling you about the case of marrying. It's because right after Abraham makes the deal to buy the cave, he sends Eliezer to bring a wife for his son. So since those 2 are in the same parsha, they can make the argument that this is a different kind of, you can have a tradition about this verb there, because it's...
so you're saying the Gzeira Shava there is connected because you have that additional connection of the fact that they're in close proximity, written in close proximity to each other. That's an interesting thought. Have you heard that before? That's your own insight.
No. Yeah, but I think the rabbis do that.
What is that?
Just because I think of something, I always assume the rabbis also knew that. They just didn't mention it. But
I'm saying this is your own insight. This is your own insight. Very nice. Interesting insight. See, the thing with the Gzeira Shava is that it has to be a tradition based.
Correct.
But even when it's a tradition, we don't always know every detail about that tradition. And meaning, like, for example, it's possible that there's a tradition that we have to learn. The word is lakicha. There's a Gzeira Shava lakicha, but we don't know which one it is. So the rabbis had to remember, if they heard it from Moshe, it had to go, there could be a debate as to which lakicha was it. Maybe it got forgotten which words is. Now we have the tradition that it's lakicha, but we might not know which one it is, and it could be it's up to the rabbis to figure out which place in the Torah where it says it. Is that the Gzeira Shava that we're supposed to be learning, or is it somewhere else? Is it some other Gzeira Shava? And so here, Taisus does it the way Taisus spells it out. He says in the beginning of Kedushin we learn kicha from Sdei Yafrim, but here we don't learn a Gzeira Shava lakicha. So he doesn't really explain himself, but it definitely sounds like he's saying that you might be surprised that we have the Gzeira Shava, kicha. How can you not learn it? Like almost like you're supposed to learn all the cases, like it should be learned in all scenarios. Or maybe what he's saying is, if you learn it here, lakicha, I was just thinking, if you learn it here, lakicha, then how do you know about maybe you wouldn't learn over there by marriage? In other
Right.
words, Reb Yehuda, what's he going to do over there? I don't know. That's an interesting way of learning it. That if he, in other words, if there's we have an understanding of a Zera Shava, so that there's a Zera Shava, but we don't know where. And Reb Yehuda learns it over here. The rabbis don't. So the rabbis don't learn it here, but they learn it over there. Would that be a question on Reb Yehuda? And maybe his answer is it's two separate words. Like it's not just because we have a Zera Shava of Lakicha or of Kicha, it doesn't mean Lakicha. Lakicha is a different word than Kicha, even though it means the same thing. Yes, Victor.
So, Rabbi, there is a Sephardic custom that some people do. They use a coin that instead of saying "betabat," so they say "bazeh," and it's by the Syrians.
It's real. It has to be
it's
silver.
a real custom.
Real coin, silver.
So
not,
we had like a silver. We use a
Yeah.
silver dollar.
Right. It has to be real silver. Otherwise, a coin wouldn't work.
It was the original, like the old silver dollars that my mother had had a jar of them from way back, but that's what we use. So there is a custom to do it.
Right.
And not that she doesn't get a ring also, but that wasn't in part of the ceremony. But in other words, we use for the ceremony, we use the silver dollar.
Right. So the interesting thing is like people aren't aware of this, I don't think, but our money would not be valid for Kedushin because our money is not real money. It has no value. It's just a paper that's almost like a contract that says we are backing silver somewhere in the treasury, but it's not real. It's not real money. So a dollar bill does not have any value. It's that it means value. It refers to something that has value, but it itself doesn't have an intrinsic value. In the olden days, the silver dollars did have intrinsic value. They were the cost of silver. So the silver dollar, that was the dollar's worth of silver. That was real silver. And it even has a bigger value. But our quarter, how much metal is in that quarter? It's worth less than a penny, whatever, maybe, So it wouldn't even be a shava pruta. It's not, it's just it happens to have a seal on it, and it's backed by the
Rabbi. The first paper money, they used to call them. It said silver certificate.
Right.
It said it on the paper. Right. They wrote on the paper, and then finally they switched it over. They just called it.
Let's not say anything.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I have some of those silver certificates. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yes, Jeffrey.
Same thing for the Pidyon Haben.
Right. Same thing for the Pidyon Haben. Right. Exactly. It has to have value. It has to be something with value. Okay. So so getting back to our Gemara. Okay. So now we've concluded with those. We just mentioned this argument of a brisa if a lulav needs to be tied together, and do you learn a gzeira shava or not? And now the Gemara says,
Rabbi, just a quick thing.
Yeah.
The gzeira shava, would you sort of translate that like it's a verbal analogy?
Well, literally, a gzeira means a decree. It could also mean like hewn out of, carved out, gazar, but it generally means a decree, and a shava means an equal decree. And if that term is used when there's a word in one part of the Torah, and that same word is repeated somewhere else in the Torah, and the tradition is that, in other words, we have tradition about those two words that they're meant to be share information from one to the other and share laws. So in other words, when Hashem gave the Torah, he specifically also gave a tradition to Moshe Rabbeinu, which words were meant. Of course, there's many words that repeat themselves numerous times, but there are certain words that were meant for to be taught as a Gzeira Shava. And he told Moshe Rabbeinu which ones they are. And that's where we have the tradition passed on from Moshe Rabbeinu, which words are meant that we're supposed to learn the laws from one to the other. So you have cases like Sukkot and Pesach, there's a Gzeira Shava there, Tesvav, it says. So there's a Gzeira Shava there. And there's a V'shava kayin uva kayin, that those are two words that are meant, they mean the same thing, and they're meant to be gzera shava. And all over the Shas, you find certain words that the Gemara understand, that the tradition was that they're meant to teach a gzera shava.
Kind of like a verbal analogy.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with that. Yeah. That term.
Like an analogy between one word and another.
Yeah, but analogy to me sounds like you're comparing.
Now, I think, David, that it would be better to say association than analogy, because analogy, it means they're different. But these are the same word in two different places, right? Is that what we're saying?
It's a comparison.
But it's not just comparing it; it's actually teaching a verbal decree. Maybe it's a decree that we have to follow these laws in both places. Those laws that are here apply there. Those laws that are there apply here. So it's a okay. Isaac, did you want to say something?
I just said they are trigger words.
You can't hear you.
Trigger words. That's his line. Yeah, it's a good line.
Words mean something. They have a certain meaning.
Trigger words. Okay.
Isaac, your thing is
very
like
low.
Sort of muffled. You're muffled.
I know.
It sounds like you're in a.
Is that better?
It's still very muffled. Not really. It's muffled.
Okay, let me finish up over here. So the Gemara says here, come on, Oslo, we are in 4 lines down from the wide lines on page 11b. Man Oslo had the Tanya lulav mitzvah la'agdoi. Who does this go like? That we have a brisa that says a mitzvah, the lulav is a mitzvah to tie it. The imloy agdoi kosher, and if you didn't tie it, it's kosher. So you're supposed to tie the lulav with the hadassim and the arabis. If you didn't, it's kosher. Now the Gemara's problem is that we just had a brisa that one opinion said you have to tie it, and the other opinion said you don't have to tie it at all. So that's where the Gemara has a problem. If you don't, either you have to tie it, it's either, you got to do it right, or there's no need to do it at all. So where do you get something in the middle over here where it says it's a mitzvah to tie it? If you didn't, it's good enough. There's like an in-between that doesn't fit with the rabbis or Reb Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Reb Yehuda, if it's Reb Yehuda, kilo yagdai, am I kosher? If you didn't tie it, why is it kosher? We have a gzeira shava lekicha from Agudas Ezoy, and that if you don't do it, Rabbi Yehuda said, all good kosher she'eno yogurt is puzzle. It's not valid. So how could you say over here the brisa that it's a mitzvah to tie? If you didn't, it's kosher. It's not kosher according to Rabbi Yehuda. It's not kosher. Rabbanon, if you want to follow the rabbis on my mitzvah, why would it even be a mitzvah to tie it? There's no gzeira shava. Why should you tie it? You're tying it. You're doing extra stuff that it doesn't say just because it says tie your by Korban Pesach, and when they were in Egypt, that Pesach they had to tie the hyssop. It doesn't say anything about tying the lulav. Why should you tie it? It's a mitzvah to tie it. So so who does this brisa go like? My answer is Rabbanan. It is the rabbi. Zumishum shenemar zeh keli v'yanveyu, because it says that this is my God and I want to beautify him. Hisna'el lefanav b'mitzvahs, beautify before him with the mitzvahs. That means that you're supposed to make the mitzvahs beautiful, and the Gemara understands that means that you're supposed to tie the lulav in order to do a beautiful mitzvah, noi mitzvah, beautification of the mitzvah. Rashi says a sukkah, beautiful sukkah, lulav na, beautiful lulav, tzitzis na, beautiful tzitzis. So this is the mitzvah of the mitzvah of Zekeli v'Yanveu, to beautify Hashem with mitzvahs, and therefore, even the rabbis who hold that you don't have a mitzvah, an obligation that's learned from the Ezoiv, the hyssop, but you do have a obligation, or a mitzvah, I should say, because you have to beautify it. And according to the Gemara, beautifying it is it means to tie it together, and tying it together, you're fulfilling a special mitzvah. But if you didn't, you're still yaitza, you still fulfilled the mitzvah. So I actually looked it up again. Yesterday we looked up just Shulchan Aruch, but the place where this is discussed is on is on Daf Lamed Gimel, where it talks about this tying the lulav, and they bring over here a number of opinions. The Mordechai writes that you're supposed to tie it with 2 knots, some in a way that would be prohibited on Yom Tov. And that, as we discussed a little earlier, it makes sense. It's hinted to in our Gemara, and in the Gemara over there as well. It's pretty much hinted to from the fact that it picked the case of where you did it on Yom Tov and not Erev Yom Tov, because if you did it Erev Yom Tov, you could redo it easily. If you did it on Yom Tov, it's complicated because you can't tie knots. So it sounds like you're actually tying a knot. So the Mordechai says, you see, and he writes in the name of the Yereim that you see it's supposed to actually be a real knot that it's usher to do on Yom Tov, and only if it's if you aren't able to tie it with a knot, then you tie some other method on Yom Tov. But the proper way is to tie a knot. Now, if it's not Yom Tov, it's Erev Yom Tov, you're supposed to tie a knot. Now, in Shulchan Aruch, it paskins the same way. It seems to follow that idea from Mordechai and the Yereim, but the Ramah says that seems like there are those. He says there are those that write to make the knot in a different way, that you just sort of like stick. You make a coil and then you stick in the extra. The leftover, the extra little stuff at the end, you stick it in to tighten it. Now the Koishikla, that's how they call these that holder. The holder, he says, there's a whole discussion about that holder in Shilas Achuvas Beis David. He writes that he says surprisingly they came up with this new minhag to which the Rishonim don't talk about, to use this holder. He says our earlier rabbis never said that this is okay. There's no tie. Right. All you do is you make this holder, and it's like some type of a screen or netting that, and you stick in the lulav, and with that you hold them together. He says it doesn't seem right because you're supposed to make a knot, and this is a different type of bundling together. It's not a knot, and he says there are 2 problems with it. One is that it doesn't. It's not a beauty that is miskayim, that lasts, because you could slip out the lulav very easily. When you tie it as a knot, it's more of a tying that lasts. So it's supposed to be a beautification that lasts. That's one problem, he says. And the second problem, he says, is that it's supposed to be similar to the way they did it on the Pesach Mitzrayim, when they left Egypt and they brought the cover Pesach, and the Para Aduma and the Taras HaMatzorah, that was with 2 knots. And when the Chachamim decreed to tie the lulav, because of Zekeli v'Amveyu, it's supposed to be similar to the tying of the Torah. So he has 2 reasons why he doesn't like these holders. This is called the Sefer Shilas Uchuvas Beis David. But then there's this other Sefer, which we saw brought in the Mishnah Berurah, that says that it's not a problem, and he argues on the Beis David, and he says that it's all about beautification, and why do you need the 2 knots? It's who says it has to be so it has to be exactly the same. And he says the main thing is that it's nice, and it's connected. It's strongly connected, and it's fine through this holder that it's you're fulfilling the mitzvah, it's beautifying it. Doesn't have to be 2 knots. And he says the Pri Megadim used this type of thing. He says the Chassam Sofer wrote similar to the Beis David, that we shouldn't make new things. And
Yeah. Yeah.
now after, so we're supposed to follow, when the Torah says to beautify, we're supposed to follow what the Torah calls beautification. And that's by tying knots. We shouldn't explain what beautifying is if the Torah tells us what beautifying is. So this is like an additional problem that the Sefer wants to say. Now, he says that after they make the ring, after you do the ring, with, in other words, with the two knots, then you could add whatever you want to beautify it, no problem. But at least do the initial thing properly, you know. And the Bikura Yaakov also seems to hold that you're supposed to tie a knot. There's supposed to be a knot that's usher on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Then he brings here that if you don't need to tie a knot, some say that you can even put the lulav together on Yom Tov. And this is davar be'itoy, it's the right time. But then he brings a whole bunch of commentaries, a whole bunch of poskim that hold, no, you're supposed to do it before Yom Tov. So anyway, it seems that from the Kisvei Arizal and other places that you're supposed to tie it before Yom Tov. And I mean, he brings a bunch of that hold it's okay on Yom Tov. But anyway, that's this seems to be the discussion. So Ezra had brought it up. There seems to be the discussion of using this thing, that it was quite debated, it seems, among the poskim. He brings at the end over here from a sefer that even if you use that thing, you have to make sure that they stick, that the hadassim, aravis, and the lulav all stick through it, and you make some type of you attach them below. Otherwise, he says it's a davar choitzitz. It would separate. This thing is going to separate between them. Rather, you should make sure to stick them through the hole on the bottom, and in a place where
they touch on the bottom through the hole. In other words,
they should go through the bottom hole, and they should stick through, which I don't think anyone does. I don't think I've ever seen that. Who sticks it through the hole? It's tight on the bottom to make. You got to like
the stems will come. The stems will come through.
Yeah, but you don't want to rip off the leaves. Who sticks it through? I've never heard of it.
They're pretty long. They're long enough. You have plenty of room.
So you've seen people stick it through the bottom. I know the lulav goes through, but the hadassim and aravais are sort of like cap. There's a cap on the bottom. Like you have to stick. You have to push it through if you want to follow this. He says that the people who do, so he comes up with, sounds like he's saying there's an additional problem of chatzitza, that it's separating when you're tying it together. You're separating. I'm not convinced that everyone would agree with that, because
it's lulav material, right?
It's lulav material. So maybe it's not such a problem. But anyway, these are the. It seems like if you add all the problems together, there's four issues of using it, which may be the reason why Sephardic people don't use it, and Chabad also doesn't seem to use that. But anyway, Zayguzunt, obviously there are other sources to use it. So have a wonderful day, everyone.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Rabbi, I'm looking at there's two Rabbi Shimon Bar Tzadok.
Yes, yeah, that's what we discussed.
Yeah,
Taisus says that. This Taisus over here on our page. Where are you reading from? From Rabbi
Wikipedia. Wikipedia.
It's probably quoting this Taisus over here. But yeah.
Somebody edited it.
Okay. Zayguzunt.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.